Okay, so we're continuing on Samach Vav Omid Beis. Just to pick up the thread, the discussion at the end of last week. Remember, we're talking about asmachta. So asmachta is a statement that someone makes, not because he actually wants the statement to be realized at some point, but it's more of a way of convincing someone to do something by sort of, I don't know, bragging, but certainly saying, oh, I have this and this and this. Let's say in the case of a loan, I have a field, don't worry about it. So the Gemara is very particular because the halacha is generally asmachta lo kanya, that if you can determine something to be asmachta, and by the way, the bar is very low to consider something asmachta. So it's more likely than not that we will say it is an asmachta, and that it's not an asmachta, sorry. The Gemara today will tell us what's perhaps an example of an asmachta that is kanya, but again, that's far and few between. So the discussion last week sort of centered at the end about when, and of course, we've been talking about the difference between saying something akin to an asmachta, maybe, maybe not, in real time, meaning if there's a loan and someone articulates something at the time of the loan, does that have more gravity than someone who, after the loan, to sort of mollify, if you will, the lender, maybe the lender was bothering him or whatever the case may be, we'll see, is you say, oh, I have the field. So we're trying to make a distinction between the two, whether it's in real time, which maybe has more of a likelihood to be accepted, and not. So the Gemara went through that, and then at the end, we wanted to sort of settle the score, and we said that when a person says it after the fact, that he's saying it because he's embarrassed. The Gemara says, "Machnas kisupa uduka amalei." He's saying it because he's embarrassed that he doesn't have the money to pay. So in order to sort of ward off the lender, he says, "Oh, but I have this field, and whatever." Again, in this case, the Gemara is saying the field is worth a lot more than the loan. But he's saying it not because he means it, but because he's embarrassed. So once again, the Gemara is telling us that when there is even the possibility of interpreting something as an asmachta, we want it to be an asmachta. We don't want people to feel that they're sort of pressed and have to make a commitment far greater than what they're capable of doing. Like in the case where the Gemara said, if I lend you the money, you don't pay me in 3 years, you give me the field's worth 2-3 times the loan. That's not fair. So the Gemara says, no, that's only an asmachta. So anyway, so the Gemara, that's what the Gemara said, no, you cannot
could you tilt your screen just a little bit? There you go. Perfect.
Okay. We can't extrapolate from there because that clearly is an asmachta. So now the Gemara says, let's see where we are, around maybe half a dozen lines from the top, a little bit more. Below he. It's about maybe 8 lines from the top. The Gemara says, okay, so we want to make a distinction between real time and not real time. And we say in not real time, it is because of embarrassment. But in real time, we're saying that the lender is kind of, because that was clearly an agreement between the parties. That's how the Gemara sort of sets the stage. Right? The Gemara Velohi, but that's not valid. Afilu zimna, even if it was made in the time of the loan, meaning b'shas masa, nami lo kani. Why do you say that the chilik between real time and after the fact is because after the fact is embarrassment and in real time there's no embarrassment? Even in real time, he is not a kohen. And why did the Bara said to him, remember this situation is where during the course of the loan, before it's repaid, he sort of blurts out to the lender, Kani, oh, okay, you can be kind to my property. So therein the Gemara says is that in real time it's valid, and not real time it's not valid because of embarrassment. Now the Gemara asks the kasha, how do you say that in real time it's valid? Why did he say kani? Because savar, why? Because the borrower thought to himself, I'm sort of warding off the inevitable that when the time comes for me to repay him, I won't have the money. So therefore, I just said to him kani so that he's sort of mollified and won't bother me. So it seems that from the Gemara's standpoint, the Indian of the borrower kind of warding off, whether it's embarrassment or harassment or whatever the case may be, is a valid answer for why he says something that in other words, in other times, would be a commitment. If he says to him, Kani, and he uses that word, then it should be Kani, then he should be Koneh. Again, the Gemara is trying to find reasons why a person should not be obligated, that it's merely an asmachta. So you can see from these Gemaras that we bend over backwards to accommodate it. In the case where the Gemara gave before, where it was after the fact, we say it's embarrassment. And even in real time, he doesn't use the term embarrassment. He uses the term, harassment, let's just say, that he won't harass me because I said kani. So that's how the Gemara concludes and says that in all those situations, using the word kani, your koneh, it's yours. When a person made such a loan, in all cases, it's an asmachta lo kani. So you see the pattern here is that every which way you look, the Gemara is going to try to minimize the statement, even though on the face of it, it looks like, if a person makes a statement, you should hold him to what he says. Why do we always try to find sort of an excuse not to let him off the hook? But it seems that the Gemara is saying this because too often, in all likelihood, what happened is, especially in the times of the Gemara, is when a person made a loan, borrowed money, he probably didn't have the money to repay. They were not wealthy people, and a person borrowed the money and he happened to have a field. He says, oh, my field is there, don't worry about it. So the Gemara must have realized or said that was never meant as a form of repayment. Now, why? And we're going to see the Gemara says this, is because there's a difference between karka and metaltalin. There's a difference between land and movable objects. People don't want to sell land. Land is sort of the grid of the earth. And so if a person has a piece of land, then he has something of value. People are very reluctant, more or less in the Gemara's time, maybe today not as much, but in Gemara's time, to sell land. So when land becomes the collateral, we're not quick to say, oh, let him take the land. That's what you're going to see from the Gemara. That's what's underlying a lot of these discussions, is that a person, when he uses land as a mashkin, as a collateral, he never really intends to sell the land. And that's an important point to remember, is that with that knowledge, the Gemara says, so 99 out of 100 times, it's an asmachta, an asmachta lo kanya. So that's the reasoning. That's the reasoning, is because it's land. Now, if it was metaltalin, it would be a different situation, because metaltalin, fungible items, movable objects, okay, that a person is more likely to want to give away, unless it's a family heirloom or something really valuable. But more or less, people don't have the same attachment to a metaltalin, to a movable object, as they would to karka. All right, so that's where the Gemara leaves us, is that in this setting, even when a person says kane before the due date, he never means it. He never means it really cold. And the Gemara explains, either because of embarrassment or because of harassment. Either way, the Gemara says a person is not likely to want to give that away. So that's really the pshat in all of this. The underlying principle is that it has to do with karka. And karka, as the Gemara is going to actually discuss that, the karka is something that people don't normally want to lose. So when he says it, it's not meant. Okay. Now, so we're talking about asmachta, and we say in almost every case, lo kanya. So the Gemara wants to give us an example of asmachta where it might be kanya, where it might actually take hold. And here he opens up a series of discussions about Rav Papa, because Rav Papa made a number of statements, this being the lead, and we're going to see other statements from Rav Papa. Amar Rav Papa. Rav Papa says, Haya smachta. Okay, let's just talk regularly. This asmachta, zimnin kanya, zimnin lo kanya. So the general rule is that sometimes it's koneh, and sometimes it's not koneh. Obviously, that was something we understood, but he makes this statement. All right, now, he wants to give an example. So this is an example, and we're going to have to extrapolate from the example. If I lent you $100 and you're supposed to pay me back. Now, again, we're talking about in a time when there wasn't great wealth and people needed to scrape together some money to make repayment of a loan. It was very difficult. So the lender was walking along and he sees that the borrower is gone to a bar and he's drinking shichra, he's drinking beer. So and he's regaling and he's happy-go-lucky. And in the meantime, he owes him money. So the lender is starting to think, wait a minute, this guy is sort of a freeloader. I lent him money, and rather than trying to repay me, he's going to drink. So what's up with that? So says Rav Papa Kani. In that particular case, the fact that he gave him an asmachta, it's funny. Why? Because he sees that the fellow has no intention, except he sees from his actions that the fellow has no intention of paying back. So Rav Papa wants to extrapolate that when I lend you money, your first obligation is to pay me back. If I see you drinking and regaling in a bar, that tells me you're not serious, whether or not that in point of fact, but that's what he's seeing. Says Rav Papa, when you see that, then kone, that means that what he said, he meant. All right, that's a little bit sort of difficult to understand, that when he said, I'm giving you my field, he meant it, because he has no intention of paying back. Why? Because he's drinking beer. Okay, that's, according to Rav Papa, that's a scenario where an asmachta is kanya. Now, now, what happens, again, another simon, if he finds the borrower and he sees him, he's going from door to door, or he's doing everything in his power to raise money to repay, which shows his seriousness, that's what this is about, he shows his seriousness, then says Rav Papa, lo kanya. Then it's an asmachta lo kanya. So Rav Papa is hanging his hat on the actions of the borrower after making the loan, and he wants to say that if he's frivolous and not making an attempt to repay, that shows that the asmachta was not meant just as a sort of statement of puffing or whatever, that he meant seriously, I have a field, I'll give it to you. I mean, you can take from my field. So, but on the other hand, if he does act seriously to repay, then that's the siman that he didn't mean to give him the land, and asmachta lo kanya. Very interesting how Rav Papa states it, but he wants to give us an example of where asmachta kanya. So that's according to Rav Papa, sort of the guidelines. What's the intent of the borrower? And the intent of the borrower tells us whether the asmachta was meant just as a throwaway, or whether he meant seriously, yes, you can take my field. Okay, that's what Rav Papa says. Strike the Gemara. Okay, now right away, when Rav Papa made that statement, then there is, the Amoraim are now up sort of what's going on with that. So in a discussion between Rav Acha Medifta and Ravina, not directly to Rav Papa. Rav Papa made his statement. Rav Acha Medifta says to Ravina, who was the sort of the gadol of the time, the Rosh Galusa, he says to him, Dilma lefachuche pachte koshosi. So listen to this. He wasn't drinking because he was frivolous and didn't want to repay, which on the surface it seems to be. He's learning pshat that, you know why he's drinking? Because he's overwhelmed. He's going to default on his loan. How many times do we know or see someone drowning themselves in drink in order not to be weighed by the pressure of what one has to do? So he's being down the kapschus, and he's saying, no, he's not drinking because he's frivolous and doesn't want to repay. He's drinking because he has no means to repay, and he is totally anxiety-ridden. So how do you get rid of that? You drink, and that lifts your spirits, right? That's what drink often does. So Rav Acha Medifta is finding a reason to negate Rav Papa's theory that if someone is drinking, then he's not looking to repay, and therefore, asmachta kanya. It's fascinating how the Amoraim are trying to, at all costs, now you notice, and we've said this, at all costs, to find a reason not to let the lender take the field. So that's one interpretation that Rav Acha Medifta asked Ravina. How does Rav Papa say that? Maybe that's not the case. Or Inami, another alternative thinking is Inish Achwina, another person, Asmechei Azuze. He found a benefactor, and that benefactor is going to pay off the loan. I mean, maybe he went to a gemach, I don't know. He went somewhere, and someone said, don't worry, I'll take care of it. So now he's carefree, so he's rejoicing in his good fortune by going and drinking. Again, we can't get into someone's mind, but in terms of the discussion, Rav Papa said this is a clear benchmark of asmachta kanya, and Rav Acha Medifta said to Ravina, why should we follow Rav Papa's thinking? There's a number of good excuses as to why someone's drinking. All right, he's drinking because he can't deal with the reality, or he's drinking because someone already gave him a pledge, and he's able to make the repayment, so he's rejoicing because he doesn't have that burden. So again, in line with what the Gemara is doing, Rav Acha Medifta is asking, just because you see something and you think that's the definitive answer as to why a person is frivolous because he's drinking, says the Gemara, no, not so fast. We can interpret the drinking a couple different ways. So again, we see an intent, a very strong intent, not to allow this asmachta to be something that asmachta kanya, that the borrower should lose the field. So this is the kasha that he asked Ravina and Rav Papa. What does Rav Papa mean when he says that? So Ravina, I guess he's defending, he wants to understand in this discussion what Rav Papa meant. Okay, Rav Papa is not part of this discussion right now, but he wants to answer Rav Acha Medifta as to what he meant. So what does he say? So this is, again, we're looking at sort of a fascinating unfolding of circumstances, each of which can be interpreted one way or the other. So he says, all right, the borrower now gave a deadline, and he's going to repay the lender. So if on that day, then the chayra, he should liquidate some assets to pay off the loan. That's what people do. You have a loan and you don't have the cash, so you liquidate assets in order to pay off the loan. And you see that this borrower has other possessions and he's not willing to negotiate. Let's say he has an item worth $100 and someone comes and says, I'll pay you 75. So Ravina says, if he were serious about paying off the loan, he would take 75. At least that gets him somewhere close to the amount of the loan. And he would do that with other possessions. If, on the other hand, if a person is in need of paying and he's immovable on his price, says Ravina, that's the reason why we say that asmachta kanya is because he didn't have an intention of paying back by allowing his properties to be negotiated. That shows, according to Ravina, that his statement is, in fact, that it's not an asmachta, but he means it, and he's going to pay him, unless, of course, he gets his price. But if the market doesn't allow him to get his price, then he can't have it both ways. He can't not pay, but not be willing to sell anything to get money to pay, right? That's the thinking. So Ravina says that in that particular case, vade kone, that he's vade kone. Again, why? Because you look at the borrower's actions. Now, in the case of Rav Papa, he said the borrower's actions of drinking are show that he's not serious. And then Rav Ahmed gave two reasons why that simon of drinking is not a valid way of interpreting his mind. So Ravina answered him, okay, forget about the drinking. Forget about the drinking. You're right. There are ways of interpreting that. But if it comes to pay, and he has items that he can liquidate to pay, and refuses to negotiate, okay, so someone wants to pay him, but not pay him his exact price, then vade kone. That's, again, we have to get into the mind of the borrower. That's what this is all about. What is the borrower thinking? Anyway, that's the whole pshat of asmachta. Does he mean it, or is he just sort of bluffing and in order to get the loan to show that he's worthy, that he has the money, and then he certainly hopes to repay him. But if not, he didn't mean to actually give him his property. Says Ravina, no. That the test of whether or not he's serious is what does he do with his other properties? And again, in this particular case, we're not talking about a pauper who has nothing. Okay, that might be a different circumstance. We're talking about someone who borrowed money because they needed cash and he didn't have cash on hand, but he can sell off property to pay back the loan, right? And again, thinking about modern times, that's kind of the way things work. I mean, if you have a loan and you can't repay the loan, but you have assets, then you sell assets in order to repay the loan. Otherwise, the lender will take, the bank, the lender will take the property. And okay, you have assets, so pay us for those assets. That, according to Ravina, is the siman of whether or not he meant it or didn't mean it. So that's Ravina's teretz to the kasha that Rav Ahmed made on Rav Papa's theory that by drinking he would show his cards. So not so fast, says the Gemara. Okay, so Ravina gave a teretz. So now Rav Ahmed goes back to Ravina and said, okay, you're making this distinction because you're going to look into his mind and say he has the ability to pay back simply by selling assets. And if he doesn't want to sell assets, that's a sign that he doesn't want to repay. So therefore, it's not an asmachta. The asmachta, it becomes an asmachta when there's a hava amina, even a thought that that property was not meant as collateral. That's really the underlying theory of asmachta. And why we say lokana is because we're always giving the borrower the benefit of the doubt. We're saying that the borrower never meant it, and various reasons why he didn't mean it. That's the rule. Now, we want to find an exception to the rule where we say that it is Kane. So this is what the Gemara is discussing. So now he gave a teretz. So Rav Ahmed Yifta asked Ravina that you're saying that the criterion is, would he liquidate assets in order to pay it? It comes with a novel theory. Dilma Savar, maybe the borrower thinks, that, you know what? If I'm going to start discounting my everything that I have, then people are going to come in when I want to sell, and they're going to refuse to pay me my price because they're going to see that I'm willing to discount. So once I have a reputation of being someone who is willing to discount, then no one will take me seriously when I say this is worth $1,000. They'll say, okay, we'll give you 800. So in other words, to protect the integrity of his property, he's not willing to negotiate. So Rav Ahmed Yifta is saying to Ravina, how can you say again that the underlying principle of asmachta is whether or not he's willing to sell assets in order to have money to repay? That's not a good way of looking at it. He doesn't want to sell a discounted asset. If he got a fair value, he'd sell. But either because people know he's desperate for money, then they come to him. And by the way, this is obviously a ma'aseh b'chol yom. This happens all the time. Is that when people are struggling and the word is out, then the fire sale is on. There's no question that people will not pay face value, even for a good property, when they know there's a possibility they'll get a discount because someone is desperate. I mean, this is reality. This happens today. So certainly in the time of the Gemara, he's saying, you know why? He was afraid of discounting because then he would undermine his whole position. So therefore, Ravina's teretz of when he slugged up Rav Papa, Ravina's teretz isn't a valid teretz that has to do with selling property. So again, we're going back and forth. And so where do we stand after this kasha? So now we're going to go back to Rav Papa. So Rav Papa made the original statement and it was negated, and then with a different theory, and that theory was negated. So Rav Papa is seeing all this. He's saying all these kashas, everything that he means to say. So now the Gemara comes back and says, Elo Omer Rav Papa. Rav Papa, okay, I'm going to revise my thinking. If the due date has come and he has to repay, and the borrower is absolutely not going to sell any property to pay it, really on the face of it, Vade Konen. So Rav Papa is saying, forget about my theory on drinking. Now that we're talking about the theory of selling the land, I'm going to revise my words, and I'm going to say that the real underlying reason why asmachta is kani, why we don't rely on the asmachta and we say that he owns it, vade kane, because we see on the face of it that the borrower is intransigent. When he has an opportunity to sell and repay, then he forfeits. So what's pshat here? That he has an opportunity. Well, he has an opportunity. So again, there's a discussion in the Rishonim, Tosfos, and other places. Are we talking about discounting, or are we talking about someone who's willing to give him fair market value for his property, which l'chayra he should accept? It's not a discount, and he says, "I'm not selling." So now we have a different dimension. It's not that he's afraid, as Ravina had said. You know why he's not doing it? Because he's afraid. Once he discounts, then everything is up for grabs, and therefore, his whole sort of business model is going to fall apart. No, we're talking about he just simply refuses to sell. Okay, if I owe you money, I've got to find a way to pay you. Okay, and if it means selling something to pay you, you should do it. You're being intransigent and saying, I'm not going to sell my property to pay you. I'll have to find another means. Says Rav Papa, that doesn't fly. That doesn't work. When you owe money, you have to repay. What you do to repay is up to you, but you have to repay. So Rav Papa draws the line, and he says, no, that I'm not going to accept the fact that a person doesn't have to repay and he has other possessions that he can use. There I draw the line and I say, Vade Koni, and it's a siman. It shows that he's not willing to pay. Therefore, his property is correctly transferred to the lender, because that's the agreement they made. Again, we're always trying to forestall that by finding a theory as why asmachta lo kanya, and we throw up our hands and say, okay, it's not an asmachta. You got to pay. So that's the Gemara's answer here as to how we look at it. So again, this whole Indian of asmachta, while it's sort of a diversion from our discussion in Ribbis, we'll get back to Ribbis shortly, but the whole Indian of asmachta is complicated, because the rabbis really have to dig into the mindset of the borrower. What did he mean when he made the pledge? Otherwise, the whole lending system will break down. People aren't going to want to lend money if they know that the borrower can sort of wiggle out of every possibility of paying because he has an excuse. Oh, it's my property. I don't want to devalue it. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. So this becomes very, very complicated. Al pi halacha it does, and therefore, we've evolved kind of in a situation today where al pi halacha, this is not really a valid way of a person makes a pledge of property, then he has an achrayus and all these excuses, if you will. Oh, I'm going to devalue my property, this, something else. That doesn't hold water. That's not the halacha. The halacha really is that a person has to find a way to repay. Again, otherwise, the whole lending system, which obviously we encourage in Jewish life, a person has to help his friend and he has to make a loan and not take ribbis. So a person really sort of goes out of his way to make this loan and have no benefit whatsoever, because you can't take ribbis, although we have the Hata Iska. But generally speaking, you're doing it as a chesed, and then the final blow is you're not even going to get your money back because the borrower has kedima to the money because of all the reasons that we see here. He'll make an excuse. So anyway, so that's the end of the story. But this doesn't talk about discounting. The answer that Rav Papa gives is, ultimately when asmachta kanya is when a person has the means and he's not going to take a loss and will get his money and he refuses to do it. That shows that it wasn't just a pledge, it was meant as a form of repayment, and therefore he's allowed to take the land. So very interesting how this Gemara concludes this situation. All right, so lest you think that Rav Papa, again, he was not necessarily, he wasn't necessarily a machmir here. I mean, we found in the beginning of this discussion that he was willing to say, the guy drinks beer in a bar. It shows he's not serious. So again, Rav Papa sort of recants and he says, no, that's not what I mean to say. I am a man of my, I'm a middle roader. I'm not a machmir. I'm not a makel, but I'm not a machmir. And this is a perfectly acceptable answer as to why a person, you can take his field because he's just intransigent. He doesn't want to, okay. So now, Amar Papa. So we're going to go take a step further. The Papa says further to this discussion, even though the rabbis, the Rabbanan, said the general rule is that asmachta lo kanya, right? The Papa has been trying to find ways where we can sort of soften that, and we see how we came out. So even though asmachta lo kanya, apotike hava lemikba minei. So This is a little different twist.
Skipped Ella Omar Rav Papa copied Ba'ara Vadai Kani.
Yeah, we say so. Ba'ara Vadai that if the borrower doesn't want to sell land even at market value, not discounted, all the reasons what we gave before about discounting, forget about it. Comes Rav Papa and he says, you know what? I believe that if a person owes the money and he doesn't pay it, and he has nechosim, he has property that he can sell at market value without taking a loss, and he doesn't do so, then that's over the line. Then vade kane, then certainly the lender is kona of that property because we're saying that it wasn't just meant as an asmachta. If it was meant as an asmachta, then he would find other ways to repay. But since he's finding no other way to repay because he refuses to sell, he doesn't want to sell anything. So how's he going to get the money? It's not going to come from heaven. So that shows, says Rav Papa, that he didn't mean just to, put off the lender or mollify him or anything else. It shows mamish that he was not going to repay him. So then we can't use the excuse of an asmachta, says Rav Papa, when on the face of it he should be repaying and he's not. So that's Rav Papa's pronouncement. Is that here's a case where we don't say asmachta lo kanya because we're not going to interpret it as an asmachta. We're going to say he actually meant to pledge the property. Again, the whole consistency of our Gemara is that the Chazal, the Rabbanim, the Amoraim, want to find excuses for why a person's pledge of land should not be held against him, and therefore the lender should not have rights. That was the whole discussion of the Gemara. And finally, I mean, the Gemara has to acknowledge that yes, while we bend over backwards to help the borrower, at some point in time, you got to face the music. He owes the money. He took a loan. It's not right for him to just say, sorry, I'm not going to repay, but you have all these possessions. Yeah, but I don't want to sell my possessions. So, I mean, there's no excuse to that. There's no excuse. So therefore, Rav Papa says that to me, that's an example where there's no asmachta. Or if you want to say, in other words, okay, asmachta kanya is that he meant it in an asmachta, but nevertheless, the asmachta doesn't stand in the way of the lender taking remuneration for his loan, gets repaid from his loan. So that's Rav Papa's answer. Okay, now the Gemara wants to say that okay, so Rav Papa now, having said what he did, makes the following statement: the general rule of the Rabbana is asmachta lo kanya. So now there's a different twist here. We're going off into something else, not just asmachta that we're talking about. You make an asmachta and you make the statement, I have a field, the field's worth this much money, and the lender is going to loan because he knows he has a good collateral. And we're saying asmachta lo kanya, that's all sort of hollow. It's sort of, he's bragging or he's puffing, and he's saying, I have this land. We're not going to hold him to it. But says the Gemara, apotike hava the mikveh bay. Even though asmachta lo kanya, what about the fact that he lent this money and he gave him what we call a mortgage? In other words, he gave him a shtar that he'll repay him from this field. Okay? The field is worth far more than the loan, and we're saying that he didn't mean to give him the entire field. But what did he mean? He meant to give him the appropriate amount of land, interest in the land, equal to the loan. If the loan was $100 and the property was worth $300, asmachta lo kanya. You can't take it from him, but you should be able to take the value of the loan, $100. That's what Rav Papa is saying. Even though they say asmachta isn't konya, you should be able to take a mortgage, the amount of money equal to his loan. So that's Rav Papa's statement. After having answered before about asmachta, he's now making another statement that I agree asmachta lo kanya, but how do you excuse the borrower from not paying anything because he actually gave him a mortgage from his property? This is Rav Papa's extrapolating. He gave him a mortgage from his property at least equal to the loan. So Rav Huna Brei Rav Nosson Rav Papa. So Rav Huna Brei Rav Nosson said to Rav Papa, Mi kamalei kanu leguvaino. All the borrower said to him was, take my field as collateral. The field obviously is worth much more money. And so we're saying that's an asmachta and lo kanya. Did he say to him, oh, by the way, you can mortgage my property to the amount of the loan? He never said that. So Rav Huna Berei de Rav Nosson is asking Rav Papa, how do you come to say, which he said before, that even though there's no asmachta, you still inherently have a mortgage for the amount of the loan? That was never discussed. All that was discussed was, I have this property worth $300 and I'm pledging the property. And we're saying that doesn't hold water because that's an asmachta and asmachta lo kanya. Now you want to say, oh, by the way, when he said that, he also meant you have a mortgage on my property and I'll pay you the value of the loan, which means only $100. It says that never happened. You want to say that you can do that, but where do you see in any discussion that there was an agreement that he could mortgage the property? When we say mortgage, we mean use the collateral for the amount of the loan, as opposed to just saying take my property regardless of what it's worth. It didn't happen. So how can you say that l'chayra that doesn't work? So that's a kasha and Rav Papa. So kasha and Rav Papa, the Gemara will answer it shortly, but the Gemara wants to think about something before giving the answer. So Rav Papa gave that. So the answer is, the kasha is, where does it say it? Okay, we're going to see shortly. Now, so according to the kasha that Rav Huna Berei Rav Nosson asked, let's theorize that was said, that in the course of the negotiation, the borrower said to the lender, you have a mortgage on my property for the amount of the loan. Okay, he said it. Let's say he said it for the amount of the loan. What's the halacha? What is it? Is it valid or is it not valid? Because he said it in real time and he gave him an alternative. First he said, take my field. And then he said, but you could mortgage my properties at the amount of the loan. Which, again, according to Rav Nosson, he's asking the kasha on Rav Papa, where do you get this theory from? It was never said. So now the Gemara wants to discuss for a moment what happens if he does say it. Omele Marzutra Rav Mori Ravina. So again, Ravina was the place in Gador. So everything came to Ravina. So he asked him, he said to him, the Omar Kone Lemig Bimine Koni. if you're going to say that if he spoke out, by the way, my field can be mortgaged up to the amount of the loan, he said it. Okay. Is that valid? He's asking Ravina, is that valid? So achmachtahi. In other words, even that's an asmachta, asmachta lo kanya. So we have to understand this. Here we're saying that when he makes the sort of general statement, you can have my property and it's worth far more than the loan, that's an asmachta lo kanya. But if I give you the mortgage, then that's okay. If I give you the mortgage, you should be able to collect the mortgage. So the kasha was, but did he even say it? No, we didn't. Now the Gemara wants to theorize, but if he said it, would that be acceptable? So he wants to understand, okay, he never said it, but if he would have said it, would it have been acceptable? So he said to Ravina, how could you say that mortgage would allow him to collect up to the value of the loan? It's that too is an asmachta. Why? We'll see in a minute. Asmachta lo kanya, and an asmachta is not koneh. So how are we to understand this circumstance where we change the lashon and we want to say that he didn't mean to give him the whole land, he meant only to give him the equivalent of his loan. Now the kasha is that acceptable? And the Gemara is telling us here that it's not, but what happens if he would have, because he didn't say it. The Gemara says because he didn't say it. But if he would have said it, that still is not acceptable. It's an asmachta. Now, why is that an asmachta? So let's think about this a minute. It's an asmachta to say that I'm sort of puffing and giving you overvalue for your loan. That's an asmachta. He didn't mean it. But if he says, according to this Gemara, if he would have said, I'll give you the mortgage, he didn't. But if he would have said, I'll give you the mortgage, that should end the discussion. That was a specific statement that I'm going to repay this mortgage from the field. And the Gemara says it's an asmachta. So the thinking here is that, you remember Rabbi Yehuda told us that in a situation where there's there's two alternatives to pay, and one is ribis and one is not ribis. Says with Yehuda, even the ribis way is not ribis because you had a choice to go the other direction. So that was a kula that Rabbi Yehuda gave us, is that no, just because you paid the way that induces ribis doesn't make it ribis because there's an alternative. This is what the Gemara is trying to say, that he could have repaid him. I mean, this is a little bit an interesting stretch. He could have repaid him. And if he would have repaid him, then clearly this is an asmachta. So the Gemara wants to tell us that if if he made a commitment to pay him, and in other words, he made a commitment to pay him, but he could have paid it through raising money and not using the field, that negates the asmachta. Now that's a real, I mean, it's not how we think of asmachta, right? We look at asmachta and we say that if he's puffing and over-exaggerating, okay, but we're trying to hone in on ways when an asmachta is kanya because he really meant to use the field. Now you're going to tell me, oh, by the way, it's an asmachta even if he mortgaged the property for the exact amount of the loan, because he could have paid him the loan through raising other money and paying cash. So, in other words, forget about it. There's no...
Rabbi, wasn't that alternative always available?
Say it again?
Wasn't that alternative always available?
That's right. That alternative was always available. And so the Gemara is now stating as a matter of doctrine that An asmachta is lokanya because you always have the ability to do it another way. That's pshat in asmachta lokanya. Because an asmachta never has roots. It never has a firm setting in the ground because you can always find a way to pay otherwise. And once you can find that way, then it's an asmachta and asmachta lokanya. You're exactly right, David. This is what the Gemara wants to conclude here and wants to tell us that this whole principle that we've been talking about, asmachta, kanya, asmachta lokanya, Rav Papa says asmachta lo kanya. It's never konen. But in the case of a mortgage, we'll allow it to be konen. So the Gemara says, oh, but there was no mortgage. But what happens if there was a mortgage? Then the Torah says it's still lo kanya, because by its definition, you have just like, again, I'm paralleling it to Rabbi Yehuda, because once you have alternative means, and you do have alternative means to something, maybe sometimes you don't have any alternative. Okay, I grant that. But when you have a way of paying, then it's not ribbis. Even if you pay him with the ribbis, it's not considered ribbis. So too, an asmachta basically is never koneh, because we can say, oh, pay him cash, or we'll find other ways to pay him, not through the property. And again, this goes to what I said earlier, which the Gemara actually is going to, I should say next, is that land it's irrefutable that a person who owns land will not want to sell his land. So if that's the mindset, that a person always protects his land, then no matter what he says, mortgage, not mortgage, it doesn't matter. There'll always be a circumstance where there will be a resistance to making the payment. So the Gemara wants to tell us that asmachta lo kanya, and therefore, even if he speaks out and says this is a mortgage, you can't get it because it's considered to be asmachta. It's exactly the point, David. And so going back to all the Gemara and all the discussion, so we have to think in our minds. We had all these discussions, and it was useful discussion, but at the end of the day, it never had a reality. It never had a reality. That's what he wants to. The Gemara wants to extrapolate from this Gemara that it's one thing. Okay, if I said there's a mortgage, okay, but there wasn't. But even if there was a mortgage, it still doesn't work. That's the upshot of the Gemara. Okay, so that was sort of a incidental statement. We're going back to the original statement of Rav Papa, who said that with a mortgage, okay, this is the discussion that Mar Zutra had with Ravina, and he's tying. Wait a minute, there's never really an asmachta. Rav Papa doesn't hold of that. Okay, that's the aside discussion between Mar Zutra, Berei de Rav Mori, and Ravina. What about Rav Papa? Okay, Rav Papa was also a gadol, right? And he asked the kasha, and he said that the mortgage is what resonates here. Says the Gemara, Ela apotike, the Gemara Papa Mai. What about the mortgage that Rav Papa spoke about that is not an asmachta? It wasn't the entire property. It was specifically, and how do we know it? It's inherent. He didn't speak it out. He didn't say, oh, by the way, I'm going to mortgage my property. It's inherent. So what do we do? The Amalei, because in that circumstance, lo yelepo peron elamizu. So now, having made the statement, okay, I'm going to give you my field after 3 years if I don't repay the loan. What he means to say is, I'm not going to liquidate any other property to pay you this loan. It's only going to come from this property. So in other words, yes, I have 3 years to repay, but for some reason I don't repay, you can't go to my other properties and force me to sell anything. So now it's a different dynamic because we're talking about a situation even though he says asmachta lokanya, the fact that he pinpointed, according to Papa, the fact that he pinpointed this property as the property from which you can take a mortgage, not the entire property. Because Papa is saying, forget about taking the entire property. I won't force that, but I will enforce a mortgage, a specific mortgage to the amount of the loan. So Rav Papa wants to say, you know why that's valid? Because the borrower made a statement. And he said, I'm not going to allow you to take repayment from anything other than this property. So according to Rav Papa, once you make that statement and you hone in on the fact that it's only this property, nothing else, that will repay the loan, says Rav Papa, okay, now it's a different dynamic. What's the dynamic? The dynamic is that if he said, and again, it seems to be inherent because we already said that he didn't say it. He didn't say it's a mortgage. But contra Papa, he meant, you can't, I'm giving you my property after 3 years, and it's not the Lokanya, that doesn't work. But inherent in the discussion is he's saying to the lender, oh, by the way, you can take from my property up to the amount of the loan. And it's only this property you can take, not anything else. That's Rav Papa's theory here. So Rav Papa is saying that when that's the case, then for sure you are allowed to take the property and still hold the smachta lokanya. And according to him, by the way, he argues in what Marzutra said to Ravina that it's an asmachta. He says no. At that point, it's a valid agreement between a buyer and between a lender and a borrower. And if it's a valid agreement, you can't wiggle out from the agreement. So once again, we see that there were differences of opinion in the underlying question of what's considered an asmachta. So according to Marzutra, who said to Ravina that, first of all, we say that he never said it. Okay, when they spoke out the agreement, he never said, oh, by the way, you can have my mortgage. But they never said it. Okay, but if he would have said it, says the Gemara, according to this, it's still no good because it's an asmachta. Says Rav Papa, basically, I don't agree with that. That if the borrower said, that this is the other condition, the borrower said to the lender, I'm going to repay you. But when I repay you, it's only going to be from this property. So he's adding a clause to his agreement, which means that the lender has no option, no alternative to collect from any other source. He must collect it from this property. Says Rav Papa that there's a mortgage. He meant to say there's a mortgage because otherwise, I mean, again, this is protecting commerce. It's protecting the whole integrity of a lender and a borrower. So at some point, I mean, we side with the borrower. There's no question about it. But at some point, the lender has to have some traction. We got to give him something. Otherwise, he won't make a loan because he's going to say, come the end of the story, I'm never going to get my money back. They'll always find a way to say, no, we'll kick the can down the road, and okay, you'll never get your money. So in order to protect the integrity of the system, says Rav Papa, I'm going to allow that a person can collect the amount of his loan in the property. Now, why is that important? So let me just add a footnote. Why it's important is because this mortgage is going to give the lender ownership of a portion of the land. That's the key. In other words, he's not giving him money, he's giving him a portion of the land. So now the lender owns a portion of the land. What happens if the borrower comes into money later? And he says to the lender, here's your $100, give me back the land, the portion of the land. The lender can say nothing doing. The lender can say, I own a portion of the land and it's not redeemable. That's really the punchline. Is why is this whole discussion about the land so important? Is again, land is land, and we know that that's the ikar. But when a person has a mortgage and gets repaid on the mortgage, he's getting repaid on the land and he owns that land. The borrower can no longer get that land unilaterally. He has to negotiate with him. And if the lender says, I'm not giving you the land, and the borrower says, I have the money, tough luck. You lose. You already, quote unquote, sold the land. You mortgaged the land, you sold the land. That's why this is important, is because once a person gets a hold of a portion of the land, then there's no longer the ability to liquidate. So that's really the key here. The key here is that land is inviolate. And again, I think that portion of the Gemara will come a little bit later. But I'm just saying, land is something that people almost universally don't want to give up. They'll give up metaltalin, they'll give up everything else, but land they won't give up. So if they don't give up land, then they'll protect it to the extent they can. And we, the Chachamim, say we want to help and protect it. Says Rav Papa, I'm with you. That's not the Lokanya, but there's got to be a circumstance where the lender can get repaid and the borrower cannot just nix his opportunity. If the lender is able to collect from another source, okay, so he goes to Bezdin or whatever it is and negotiates with the borrower and says, you have this and this and this, I'll take your wheelbarrow, I'll take your cow, whatever it happens to be. So that's not a problem. But if the borrower says to the lender, you can only collect from this land, he's tied the hands of the lender. The lender has he agreed to it, by the way. He said, okay, fine. He has no option. And if you're going to pull the rug under him and say, okay, he said it, but now you can't collect, that doesn't go to the Republic. No, there's got to be an end to the discussion. And the end to the discussion is that he can't take the whole property because that's an asmachta, no question. But he can take the amount of the mortgage, which is agreed upon, and that he can collect. So again, we're looking at all different kinds of circumstances. The Gemara is giving us about an asmachta, how it works, when it works. And it's a fascinating discussion because, again, we start with the principle of asmachta lokanya, and we're trying to carve away little by little. So how about this situation? What about that situation? So basically, Rav Papa is not agreeing with Mar Zutra, because Mar Zutra said, remember what we said, that an asmachta, if you can pay through another source, is not an asmachta. But here, there's no other source, right? There's no other source. So Rav Papa is saying, even according to your words, where you want to say that a mortgage isn't valid because that too is an asmachta, why is it an asmachta? Because you can pay through something else. But if the borrower says to the seller, you're not getting paid through anything other than this property, now he's totally tied the hands of the lender. Under that circumstances, Rav Papa, your principle, Mazitra, of asmachta lokanya does not apply. So again, it's a fascinating understanding of this whole discussion, which next week we're going to pick up. But again, we're going to get to, I'm making the point because the Gemara will tell us that a person rejects any opportunity to pay from land. But there are times, as Rav Papa says here, when we have no choice, when the borrower is the one who made the deal and he set the terms, and the terms were 3 years and I don't pay you, you get an equivalent to your loan. There's no wiggle room. Then he already set the tone. And basically he's taking out the legs under the theory of asmachta, which Rav said is because you can pay another way. But he said you can't pay another way. Anyway, so that's the end of the Gemara here. We're going to go on to Rav Papa. Again, Rav Papa is now the subject of our discussion because he, as is done in the Gemara, once we cite something from an Amora, then we pile on with other things the Amora said, which are tangential or not directly on point. So next week, we're going to talk about other things Rav Papa said, also somehow related to Asmachta, but it's a little bit further afield, because we're talking in the sugya of Rav Papa, so we want to give Rav Papa his due. Anyway, it's a fascinating discussion, and Mitzvah Shem, you know, we'll come to the point, I guess, loss of love, when, again, people won't have to borrow from one another, but all of these halachos will become clear to us as to what the underlying rationale is. And here the machlokes between Rav Papa and Mazutra and his view will all be reconciled. So,